Welcome everyone to Through the Void Gate, a Warcaster podcast for new and experienced players. Deploying in 3.
What's going on, everybody? Welcome to episode 6 of Through the Void Gate. I'm here with Justin.
Howdy.
And Spencer.
Hey, everybody.
Before we get started, I wanted to let everyone know we can now be found on all podcast services through the More Than Dice network. And speaking of which, on our 4th episode, we had over 1,000 listens so far. And we can't thank you guys enough for all the support. That is absolutely amazing. And you guys are the reason we do this, so we totally appreciate it.
Thank you.
100%.
So now, let's get right into what's going on with the community. Spencer?
Right, so we've got some news for everybody. So obviously, based off of what this podcast topic is, Pendulum just dropped on Wednesday, which is super exciting because I've been waiting for that for a while. Following that, the Pendulum prize kits are also available. So there is a Scourge misprint on the prize kits for the Warjack loadout cards, but it has been confirmed that that is in fact a misprint, so don't worry about that. Now, on that same note, Privateer Press stated on Wednesday in their Kickstarter update that they do have some updated stat cards for us from the Kickstarter 2 models coming out. So they were meant to post that on Wednesday, but we're having some issues with the Kickstarter images uploading. So we get to look forward to that here very soon. So we know a couple of the cards that are already getting updated, like the Fulcrum and the Mantlets. We expect the gate launchers to get updated, and so I'm really excited to see what else they decided needs some tweaks.
And Mira's ability should be updated on those cards as well.
Yes, Mira as well. Now, we also have confirmation that the smoke tests for the backer kit are also out, so we should be having the backer kits available very soon, so we can decide exactly how we're spending all the money we decided to give PP.
Yeah.
Some more than others, Spencer.
Yep.
Well, I know they got a lot of mine now. Anyways, as far as other community involvement, other podcasts and such, Charge and Spike just put out a really interesting episode on ISA. I particularly like the lore half. They call it their charge section of the episode. That was a great listen. If you really want to know a little bit more about the world, just give that a listen. I think it's over the first half of the episode, so enjoy that, have fun. It's got some really interesting stuff in there. Also, I want to call out that Hyper News Network needs your hate mail. I know that Red is the only one I've really personally talked to out of that group, but he loves the hate mail. Spencer definitely gave him a really good one, and I'm still trying to come up with something that's good enough to match that.
Yeah, so make sure you give them a listen so you can send them over some good content, and then from there they can be reached at hypernewsnetwork@gmail.com.
Red needs informed hate mail, okay?
Absolutely.
Don't give him half-assed hate mail.
We only support quality content on this podcast.
So I guess that brings us into today's topic. Pendulum. It dropped on Wednesday. There's a lot going on in this packet. If you're not aware, Pendulum is Privateer Press's official rules for how to run their tournaments for Pendulum. So it's their official format for Warcaster in the future. What this basically is going to do, it's going to run down and give TOs guidelines on how to do different things. And just to clarify, they even bring up in here that these are mostly guidelines. There's a little box on page 2 that says it's your toolbox. It basically gives TOs a lot of wiggle room on a lot of this. So don't feel like these are set in stone on a lot of them. There's some wiggle, and it's a suggested format for their tournaments. For one of the things it's going to bring up is the force list. Spencer?
Right, so we're going to be going through a quick rundown of what you can find in the Pendulum document, and then we're going to be talking about our thoughts on it later on in the episode. So kicking off with the list building. So one of the first things that you do when you sign up for a tournament is you're going to submit your force lists. So we're going to talk about it a little bit more, but it is a escalation style. So there are going to be different game sizes and game modes that will be played. So you submit a list for each of those game sizes. Now, Once you've done that, you will also submit a cipher deck. Now, the cipher deck is going to be across all of your lists. So you use one cipher deck for all of the lists that you've submitted. And you will also choose your secondary missions for each of the forces on roster submission when you create the force lists.
Part of this will also be your special issue, which is your sideboard. You will get one solo, one warjack, one squad, and one vehicle that you can choose as your sideboard. The solo slot can also be a hero, so it can move into that hero slot if you chose a hero for that slot. You can trade these in and out. Oh, there's also one of each type of cipher. So one harmonic, one overdrive, one geometric, and one fury that you can also put in your sideboard. These all switch out one for one, meaning that say I take any one thing out of my list, I can put any one thing from my sideboard in that list, as long as I don't break the list somehow. So if you've only got 3 geometrics in your list and you take a geometric out, you have to put a geometric in. However, if you've got 4 geometrics in your list and you take a geometric out, you can put any of your sideboard cards in, because then you still have a legal cipher deck at the end of it.
Yeah, and it is worth noting that as far as the units swap go, that you can swap out any unit type for any other unit type. It does not follow the same rules as long as you do not break the FA4 rule.
Right. So as long as you maintain a legal list, you are allowed to do it. So if your roster already has 4 weavers in it and you take out anything else and your solo slot happens to be a weaver, you cannot put that slot in. So just be careful of that. I think it's more important for the cipher deck, because I think it's a lot easier to break that than to break the list. But just keep in mind, it's a 1-for-1 without breaking the rules for making those different things.
Right, which means that the size of your cipher deck never changes.
Right. That's actually a very important thing. It isn't like I can choose to put in 2 cards from my sideboard and only take 1 out. It's a 1-for-1. So just be very, very careful of that. It's an escalation format. So depending on how many players show up to your event determines how many skirmish, modified skirmish, and primary missions you're going to be playing. Primary missions are what we usually call the full-size missions. They're the ones played on the 48x48. The other 2 mission types are played on the 30x30 mat. The first regular skirmish is what we all know, the 8 regular choices and 1 hero slot. Hero solo slot, I should specify. And the modified skirmish, which is 11 selections and 2 hero solo slots. So depending on how many people you have at your tournament determines how many of each of those games you're going to be playing. So it could be as few as 8 or fewer people showing up to your tournament. It's a 3-match event, and you'll be playing 1 of each of those size games. And it levels up, but it generally does tend to favor having more skirmish games than primary mission games. So as you level up, once you have 9 to 16 players, you'll be playing 2 skirmish, 1 intermediate, one modified skirmish, and 1 primary mission. Once you have 17 to 32 players, you'll be playing 2 skirmish, 2 modified skirmish, 1 of the full size. Once you have 33 to 64 players, it's a 2-2-2 split. And once you have 65 to 128 players, which I hope we have 65 to 128 player tournaments sometime, that would be super awesome. You'll be playing 3 skirmish, 2 modified skirmish, and 2 of the primary. The scenarios are all the same scenarios from the main rulebook, and you will get secondaries for all of these because you choose them in the roster building, as Sneaky mentioned.
Yep, and the scenarios are either chosen by random, which they've provided a table for, or by EO choice.
Correct.
Now, as far as how you get paired up once you are in the tournament, they use basically a Swiss-style pairing. So the first round is going to be essentially random, and then from there will be essentially a winner's bracket and a loser's bracket. So the way that people get paired up is the winners play against each other, and then the losers play against each other. because it's based off of your score. So the two highest scoring people from the previous round are going to play each other, and that's going to continue on throughout the tournament.
And so each of your games, whenever you play, you will be playing on a death clock. Death clock, if you're a War Machine player, you're very familiar with it. In Warcaster, you'll have a chess clock. You'll each been given a set amount of time to play, depending on what size game you're playing. If you're playing skirmish or modified skirmish, you have 60 minutes on that death clock. If you're playing primary, also known as full size, you'll have 90 minutes. What happens is when it's your turn, when you're activating things, when you're doing something that's limiting the other player from doing something, so an out of activation move such as a Firebrand Reflex Cortex thing, it'll be on your clock. When you switch over to the other person, the clock goes over to them. When your clock goes down to 0, you automatically lose. So the incentive is you need to finish your game all of your turns before your clock hits 0. That is one of the 3 win conditions for Warcaster.
Yeah, and one thing worth noting is that the clock never stops. You will never pause the clock unless a judge comes over and gives a ruling and decides to pause the clock while they're giving their ruling.
Correct, because the clocks are intended mostly to keep the event running on time. If everybody has a set maximum amount of time their games can take, then it helps keep the whole event running on a certain specific schedule that the EOs, TOs can manage much better.
It's also worth noting if you have stuff happening, I'm not sure how much there is in Warcaster, but if you're doing something on your opponent's turn, usually you discuss before the game starts that if I'm doing those things, are we switching the clock over or how is that working? Because in Warcaster, there's armies that are based on tough rolls, and I know a lot of people flip the clock over so those people can do their tough rolls.
Right, and there's a little bit of sportsmanship involved there, because I know in War Machine, if I'm doing those tough rolls, but I'm being very fast about it, usually people don't worry about flipping the clock. However, if you're holding the die for 10 seconds, being like, oh, did you kill that guy? Okay. And then rolling it very slowly, and then we have a slow resolution, then people usually do tend to flip the clock.
Yeah,
They do specifically say that things that you activate during your opponent's turn, you should be flipping the clock for. And that's why I mentioned the Firebrand Reflex Cortex, because that's something you're doing a 3-inch move on your opponent's turn. They should be flipping the clock over to you while you do that.
Right. And especially things like Impulse Reciprocator, where you're attacking back or anything of that nature.
Right. Anything like that, anything where you have, more than a 2-second thing going on, they should not be flipping it back to your clock for you to remove your model after they've killed it.
Right.
Unless you're just, you went to go get a drink and you're coming back from that. I killed your model. Well, then.
Yeah, but stuff like I declare that Corvus is using Guardian, like you don't need to flip the clock for that.
Right.
Now, as far as scoring goes, so the scoring happens basically: a win is worth 1 point, a tie is worth 0 points, and a loss is also worth 0 points. Now, at the end of a match, not only are you going to record your score, but you're also going to record how many points worth of models are left on the board. And this is used for tie breaking, not only if your game itself is a tie, but also for later on in the tournament when determining pairings, as well as an overall victor. There are also rules for concessions. So if someone decides to concede a game, then the winning player receives either 5 victory points or their current total if higher, and 8 deployment cost worth of units remaining or their current total if higher. The player that concedes receives a loss and no points in any category. Now, as far as the tiebreakers go, this is really interesting. So if a match ends in a tie, meaning that both players have the exact same amount of points, then the first tiebreaker goes to deployment cost. Now, if that is also tied and both players have the exact same amount of deployment cost worth of models on the board, something worth noting is that unit attachments do not count towards this. And if the unit attachment is the only model remaining on the field, then you do not get points counted for having that squad on the field. And then if that is the same, then the players continue to play, each taking a turn. And at the end of that turn, the player who has the most deployment points on the field wins. Now, something interesting is that you can no longer score any victory points once you've gone to a tiebreaker, and all of the void gates in the field are removed from play, and you can no longer summon any void gates. So it's definitely a very interesting tiebreak scenario.
And that's a pretty broad overview of what's included in this packet. I would suggest that any tournament players that really want to dig into and find out, some of the nitty-gritty about it, take a look through, figure out what to expect when you come to it. There is, suggestions for terrain. They're pretty light. They mention, that they want you to use the quadrant method like they describe in the rulebook. There's just a lot of little nitty-gritty things that are not necessarily, worth digging deep into. But the overall format is worth knowing about and worth being aware of. And we're going to start a little dialogue here about what we do like about this format. Josh?
I was going to say real quick before we get into that, the way that you win the tournament is that the person that has the highest, that has more victory points, or more wins, than anybody else in the tournament, or more points from winning than anybody else in the tournament, as soon as there is a single person that has more points than anybody else, they win. So a tournament can actually end early if that scenario happens. Now, if there are two people that are tied at the end of a tournament with the same amount of points, then it then goes to total victory points scored, and then it goes to strength of schedule to determine a final victor. So there will always be a final victor in Warcaster tournaments.
And I guess it's worth mentioning there are 3 ways to win. One is the death clock. One is due to the mercy rule. If you're not familiar with the mercy rule, in tournament format, it's if somebody has no models, no void gates after the first pulse round at any point during a turn, they just immediately lose the game. Which makes sense because I don't know how I would play back from that situation in any mission.
Yeah, because you don't get to do anything for 3 turns. So at that point.
And then, of course, if you have more victory, if you acquire the victory point conditions of the scenario you're playing. Now, they don't actually say having more victory points, which means that leaves them a little bit future-proofed for if they decide to do something that isn't straight victory points. So I'm kind of curious to see if they play with that. But it does just say, or according to the victory conditions of the scenario played.
And now back to Josh with the good.
Okay, so if I had to pick a couple things that I'm super hyped for, first and foremost, it's the fact that we have a competitive format. At my core, I'm a tournament player. It sounds horrible, but I don't play things friendly. Like, it doesn't matter if it's video games or whatever. It has to have some form of ranked play or competitive play, or I just don't play it. So I'm just hyped to have a tournament format. And then when we actually get into the document, the first thing that I read that excited me was sideboarding.
Agreed.
Because just the chess match of sideboarding is super intellectual and really stimulating. Much like War Machine and having a 2-list format, you kind of play a little chicken with your opponent where, like, oh, I see you have this, I have this, what are you actually dropping on the board? And what do you actually have in that cipher deck? So I think that as a competitive player really excites me, and it means you're never going to, or should never play into something that you don't have an answer for. And then up and beyond that, I'm interested to see how the secondaries play out. because they're the secondary objectives are available for the tournament scenarios. You can pick one for each of your lists, and I'm interested to see how that changes list building and overall strategy going into a tournament versus just like your casual play. What about you, Justin?
Well, it's interesting you bring up secondaries there because I'm probably going to put them in the bad section personally, but we'll get there when the time comes. Actually, I'm super hyped about the way the list building is done. I think it's really interesting that you choose your forces really early, and that you have so much flex in them. I think there's going to be even a whole for a game without points and just having slots. There is kind of like a weird meta game that can go on because you have these sideboard options. You know, maybe in skirmish you never write that you're going to put Fiddle in your list, but because you have Fiddle for your Marcher Worlds over in your sideboard, maybe you just know, hey, you know, he doesn't have anything that Fiddle is particularly afraid of in this list. I'm putting Fiddle in this list. I don't care if he's got that Gatecrasher Nyx or Gatecrasher Morningstar. I'll just blow up anything he puts out of it with Fiddle and laugh my way all the way to the bank. So I think the list building and sideboard options are super interesting. They add a lot of flex to a game that technically has very little list building, like besides your Warjack loadouts, which I feel are much more, you know, crunchy than a lot of the rest of the list building. It adds a lot of crunch to list building that isn't there regularly. I also think this escalation format with some tweaks is awesome. I really like the escalation idea. I like that, you know, I'm going to play one game at the beginning of the day, and then I'm going to be in full battle force at the end of the day, and it's a different game, and it kind of takes away some of the stale feeling from tournament. I know that, you know, as a War Machine player, you know, you have those 6 scenarios that you play all the time. You don't play anything else. You know, you have 6 scenarios, and you know, there's almost a certain level of burnout that can happen with only having 6 scenarios that you play for every event. And you know, because War Machine requires so much practice, you're playing them all the time at home. You know, there's this offers the chance, like already Warcaster, even in its early stages, has 9 scenarios that you could see at the tournament, which is a breath of fresh air personally. So I like both of those things. Spencer?
Awesome. So I will echo the escalation is awesome part. And then going off of what Justin was just talking about, we've also had to confirm that once the Collision Course kit or rulebook comes out, that those scenarios are also going to be included. So that's just going to give us even more options and flexibility, which I'm super excited about. Now, I'm also really excited about the sideboard, but I think that's been talked to death. So some other things that excite me, Swiss pairing is just really simple, and I enjoy it, so I'm glad they decided to use that for their format. And then I do enjoy how much choice they've given event organizers, just because there are definitely a couple of things that I would not want to be running in my tournament, so just making sure that I have those options. And I also know other people really enjoy certain scenario types. Like I know the Hyper News Network guys love the FBF format, so giving them the option to run, you know, FBF tournaments is something that, you know, they're happy about. Now, I do enjoy the Death Clock. I think that that's really important, and glad that they put it in there. And then I do also enjoy the tie-breaking format that they have, because if you follow through with the entire tie-breaking format, it's almost impossible for anyone to tie. And ties
are so bad in this game.
Yeah, well, ties are bad in general, but especially with the way that they're formatted in this packet, ties are bad. So the
See,
fact
I'm
that
used
it's
to like
almost,
the Pokemon format where a win is 3 points, a tie is 1 point, and then a loss is 0 points. So it's not like you lose everything for a tie. So like
Right.
for me, you know, this is win or nothing. And it feels super, super weird. But I do like they've made it to where ties should happen so rare that, you know, that's not even a thing really.
Yeah, I don't know because of the way that the final tiebreak scenario, one just tying on victory points and deployment cost, is just gonna happen so rare it's already gonna rarely come up. But then the final part where you have to keep playing it out, it just means that someone's gonna get clocked out before the game ends. It's gonna happen, and it's almost impossible for it not to. So there's gonna be a winner. It's basically impossible to tie, which makes me happy.
Yes.
Because
I mean, I'm sure somebody out there will tie.
Yeah.
But it is going to be such a rare occurrence in this format. Like, I think adding the deployment cost of surviving units was such an elegant way to say, hey, look, I know you guys have the same score, but this guy has, more material on the board. I think it's a really cool, elegant way to just say, hey, this is how we're solving this.
Yeah, and then the thing is because ties, get you nothing, that it incentivizes people to play it through, because the person who winds up losing doesn't lose anything, doesn't lose out at all, because they don't lose any points from tying, because a loss and a tie is the exact same thing. So there's no, like, you might as well play it out, and it's not a feels bad, where if you went from a tie to a lose, because you didn't lose anything.
Right. If it had still stayed as just a tie, you would have had a loss essentially.
Yeah.
A tie in this game is essentially a double loss, but because it's going to happen so rarely, I don't think that's a big issue.
Yeah, and I think that's really good because of the way that the format works, and where once one player wins or has more points than anybody else is really good, because like if you're playing like an eight person tournament, in the second round, if one of the winners tables ties and the other one doesn't, then the tournament's over. Right. But because it's so difficult to tie, that's just, it's not going to come up.
It really wouldn't. I guess it still can, but it's going to be so rare that I don't think it's worth anybody wasting any breath on.
Right.
Did anybody else have anything particularly that they wanted to highlight that they were really excited for about the format?
I think I covered mine at length.
Okay. So things that we aren't so happy with. Do you want to start, Spencer?
Sure. I'll just run through some stuff and you can piggyback.
Brace for impact.
Well, let's kind of like tackle one subject at a time, because
right. That's
I don't want to glaze over something and feel like we didn't elaborate how we were feeling.
Yeah, that's what I meant. So like I'll say like a topic and how I feel about it, and then you can jump on it, and Josh can jump on it, and then we'll move on to something else.
Correct. Good.
So I'll start off, because it's the first thing on my list here, is one cipher deck for all lists. I feel like it's very limiting, because there are, you want to build your cipher deck differently for full size and skirmish, because there's different things that you want in each scenario. So the easiest thing that pops into my mind is the remove a vehicle activation token card. Like, if I'm not running vehicles in my skirmish list, because they're not really necessary in skirmish, they can be good, you can run them, it just kind of depends. Then when I go to full size, I'm probably going to want that card in there, which means that I either have to make a bigger cipher deck in order to be able to fit that card into my deck without messing it up, or I have to swap out some other really important card. So I feel like having that, it's very limiting. And then also, it goes hand in hand with that same scenario, is that the fact that the cipher deck size is locked, that I can't have a bigger cipher deck or a smaller cipher deck, depending on what the format is. I also feel is very limiting.
So here's my question. If they had two cipher deck loadouts, and it was for skirmish and modified skirmish as one, and then full size as another, would that be enough of a differentiation for you to be happy with it, or do you even think that those need a different one?
I think I would be fine with that. I would rather the sideboard just not be 1-for-1, to be honest. But
I'll be honest. I agree with you about that. I think the Cypher deck. I've actually gotten into conversations with people about the Cypher deck before it was ever this packet was ever released, and I was bringing up the idea that if they're sideboarding, you're going to have to submit a deck list somewhere, right? And people disagreed with me on that. And now when we're seeing there is a deck list, I honestly, I personally don't have any problems with this deck list situation that we have right now. Although I think you'd be crazy to be able to hold anybody to this deck list. I don't think anybody's looking over your Cypher deck and examining it that much to realize, oh well, he didn't actually have Pyrokinetic Surge in his deck. I really think this is something that probably could have been allowed to be more organic before the game, and just you have to reveal that each of your Cypher cards to the person beforehand, and just have it be, hey, I can make the Cypher deck before the game. But as it is, I actually don't have a huge problem with this. I do see your problem with the vehicle card. I also kind of have a slight problem with the geometrics because skirmish compared to full size, and that's kind of why I put that rift in there. You're going to be running a lot more units or squads in full size than in skirmish. So I think your geometrics in particular are much more important in that size game. So I think just those two are kind of the only real outliers of things that are like, well, I'm not going to be taking as many of these.
Yeah.
I just don't like it. Feels like in something that feels like it was built to give you lots of options with the sideboarding, both units and cards. The one deck per for the whole tournament just feels so restrictive, where it would have been just as easy to, since you have 3 different army sheets, just have a different Cypher deck for each army. Like there's no cohesiveness in between those two thoughts.
Yeah, I think I have no issue with the one Cypher deck. It's the one Cypher deck with the 1-to-1 sideboard. So I think if they changed either of those two, where you had either multiple Cypher decks or you didn't have to 1-for-1 on your sideboard, I'd be totally happy with it, and I would be so happy with the amount of flexibility that I had. I'd be overjoyed. But the two together, I think it instead creates a really limiting feeling instead of the open and flexible one, which I think they were going for, like Josh was saying.
I personally think they did that. This is me playing devil's advocate here. I personally did that. I think they did that to idiot proof it, so that you were less likely to mess up your Cypher deck. Because if you have, okay, well, I'm going to take these 3 out and put these 2 in. That puts me at a 12-card deck again. Okay, I get into the game and I find out I've got 4 of any one type of card because I'm used to having 4 of that one type of card. Then you're wrong, right? you end up having this bad situation where what happens when we're halfway through a game and I find out I've made an illegal Cypher deck. And I actually don't think they clarify what you do in that situation. I'm pretty sure that would kind of fall under the sportsmanship rules and, whether, somebody feels like it was maliciously done or not. But yeah. I think by doing a 1-to-1 trade like that, they make it much less likely to even have to deal with that situation.
I just find that it makes you think in sweeping generalizations when you're making your Cypher deck versus tooling it to the 3 different battle sizes. If you're going to have 3 different battle sizes, why should you have to make a sweeping generalization for all 3? It just doesn't make sense.
I agree. I think that there's room to grow with the Cypher deck. The way they've handled the Cypher deck, it doesn't super bother me personally in its current state. Like I say, I'm trying to look at it like this is probably, as a first run, probably the best they could really do, without having to make somebody write out another 12 to 15 cards again. Because this roster sheet is already pretty chunky as far as what you're having to write out. You're having to write out Jack loadouts, 8 different slots for your special issue items, your 12 to 15 slots for your regular Cypher deck, and then it's 9, 13, so it's 22, plus 18, so that's like 40 selections as far as your lists. Like there's a ton. You're writing out more than a regular like standard game format deck list in this roster form. So I think that was also a concession to try and keep people from having to write more. So I don't know. I see this as like a fine first run, but I think that there is room for growth and improvement.
Yeah, 100%. Like I can deal with it and it's fine. I just feel like it could be better. So the next thing I think I have on my list to touch on is concessions. So they're just terrible.
They are. Yeah, I think they're done a little weak. I think there could be more there, although hopefully, yet again, like I'm saying, like that situation where the Cypher deck is wrong in the middle of a game and you find out, what do you do? I'm hoping that this is another one of those situations where it's like, well, this is going to be such a fringe thing, it probably doesn't actually matter.
Yeah, well, here's the thing: is like, so concessions are just a feels bad all around. So if you're the winner, right, you get 5 points or your current total, right, which means that you lose out on all potential points for the rest of the game. And it also, which hurts your standing overall, because your pairings are rated, the tiebreakers at the end of the matches are rated based off of your victory points. So that just hurts you, right? And then if you lose, or if you're the one conceding, you get 0 points across the board, right?
Well,
so
to be fair, I'm okay with that part. If you're conceding, you probably shouldn't get anything.
Here's my thing, and this is just about how the game actually works, is that there comes times where into Pulse Round 2, it's literally impossible for you to win. So I don't want to keep playing the game at that point, but because it's just going to hurt me if I concede, right? Because then I don't get any of my victory points. I don't get any of my deployment costs. So it's just terrible. And then it also hurts the winning player because they're not going to get any points for the next Pulse Round. So it just creates a terrible situation where someone that doesn't want to be playing the game, has no agency in the game, is going to be forced to continue playing the game, because if I'm winning the game, I'm not going to accept their concession because I want my victory points.
I think what's going to happen a lot of times is you're going to have a talk with that person at the table, and they're like, "Hey, I'm going to concede. It's the end of Pulse Round 2. I'm out of this game. There's no point in me even playing anymore." And I think what's going to end up happening more often than not is, players are going to come to an agreement. Well, hey, you want to just give me the points for the next Pulse Round, and then we'll go forward. Which is wrong. Don't get me wrong. Yeah. That's not the way that you should actually handle it. But it is one way I see players handling it, because that player that's winning is not going to want to go up to the desk and say, well, he conceded, I guess I don't get the score Pulse Round 3 at all.
Yeah, it creates a terrible feels bad situation for everyone involved, right? And it's just very poorly designed.
Well, I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but what would you do to fix it?
Cool. So in the tournament that I'm running currently, if someone concedes, they still get the points that they've currently scored, because they've scored those points. They played a game. I don't feel like someone should not get recognition for the work that they already put in, right? And then the person that wins gets half of the remaining points left in the game. So if Pulse Round 3 is worth 8 points, they get 4. So the person that wins still gets points, and it makes sense if they're winning. If the person concedes, they're going to continue to getting some points. And then the person that loses or concedes doesn't feel absolutely terrible about having to concede, because they're not messing over the winning player, and they're not being unduly penalized themselves because they're in a position where there's just no point playing the game anymore. And we've both played enough to where we know this happens all the time. People concede at the end of Pulse Round 2 because you look at the board and you're just like, the best I can do is tie. And
that's only if all the dominoes fall into place, right? So
yeah,
trust me, I understand. I just kind of wanted to you to be able to defend your statement with a, hey, what would I do? Because
Right,
I always think it's always interesting to me when people have a stance and say, well, this is awful, this is terrible, I don't like this at all, and they're like, well, how would you fix it? I don't know. So I just kind of want you to be like, hey, this is a good fix right here, and then everybody feels better about it.
Yeah,
and I'm glad that you had one prepared, and I didn't have to feel bad about putting you on the spot too bad there.
No, I'm glad you brought that up, and I would have gotten there eventually, but I was this is one of the things that I was just really salty about, because I just looked at this and just us playing the game enough to where we've run into this situation enough times to where I was just like, this is I would feel terrible about this situation, and
right, because I would feel bad if you had me in that situation, and you were like, you were having to give me the puppy dog eyes because you really wanted me to play out that final pulse round just to kind of help you out there. And I was like, there's just no point, buddy. This isn't happening.
And especially if it's a full-size game and you're looking at another, 25 to 45 minutes, depending on how quickly you guys are playing. Like, I don't want to grind out another 30 minutes of a game that I have no agency in. Like, it's just.
I completely agree.
I just keep thinking of all those matches I've lost to Spencer by the end of Pulse Round 2, and how salty I get sometimes based on the way the dice went, or he pretty much tabled me.
Yeah. I mean, you can see the Pulse Round 1.
You can evoke the mercy rule there, Josh.
Fair. Fair. No, it feels like I did get mercy.
Still had Void Gates.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
But
no mercy for you, Josh.
I
will say that even the mercy rule winning, they don't, as far as I can tell, they don't actually have a way for the player that was so dominant to get points after that point. So there's actually borderline this line of thought, well, I'm going to leave your Void Gate with 1 on it so I can keep playing this game.
Yeah, it's not, yeah. It just creates bad situations.
The mercy rule should probably have some scoring similar to where your concession happened, where you still get the half the points and half your deployment costs for each pulse round that's still there.
Yeah.
Just so there isn't any kind of feel bads. Like, it would be pretty awful to mercy somebody in the first part of pulse round 2, and suddenly scenario in the same round as you because you were so overwhelmingly strong that game.
Yeah. And I just think about what continuing to play those games against Spencer that I tapped out of would feel like with me at that salt level. That is really a feel bad, both for me because I'm now grumpy at the game, and for Spencer for having to listen to me whine. It's lose-lose. So. You guys are killing me here. Okay, next topic. Let's keep it rolling.
Okay. We just hit Josh in the feels.
Yeah, Josh is out.
All right, cool. So next topic. I'll save you, Josh, because you don't have any experience with this. Secondaries for skirmish.
Oh, this one's.
I'll just take it, Justin.
I think secondaries in general need to be retooled, skirmish or full size. I think doing copy pasta of the scenarios from the main rulebook is very harmful for the game kind of choice, because some of them are just so naturally better than other ones, and some of them have points limits and other ones don't. And I think probably the biggest offender might be body count.
100%.
Especially because you choose these before you ever get to the table. Before you ever even see what the scenario or anything looks like, or your opponent's list, on your roster you're choosing your secondaries, which to me that just seems crazy too, right? Because if you see that somebody's going a heavy on the jacks and you've got, I don't know, the squads to be able to do salvage, maybe you try and do salvage sometime. But, if we're playing skirmish, I'm probably never choosing salvage. For skirmish, I feel like there's only really 3 choosable secondaries, and body count is just so much better than all the rest of them that it's a no-brainer to just take it.
Yeah. I mean, it's just body count is not only one of the easiest to get as far as points, it also has no maximum point limits, and it's consistent. You know that no matter what the scenario is, no matter what the terrain is, you're going to be able to pull it off. So there's really no point choosing anything else, especially when the points values of other things are so off. Like destroying a void gate is typically pretty hard, and it's only worth 1 point. So
Right.
it's just a little weird the way that they've done the secondaries. But the main thing is like, and we'll talk more in depth about secondaries and scenarios and stuff in a later episode we're going to be doing here pretty soon. But secondaries for skirmish specifically, especially when you include body count into the category, it's just way too easy to get the secondaries. There's a reason that in the normal, like the original rule book, it says you don't choose secondaries in skirmish. But then for Pendulum, they reneged on that and then added in secondaries, and it's just crazy because there's been games there. I mean, this one game in particular pops into mind where Justin tabled me. I only had two models on the field: it was a Morningstar and a Firebrand, or not a Morningstar and a Firebrand, Morningstar and a Weaver. So he didn't get body count, and then the next turn I deploy a gate. The next turn I summon models, and then he couldn't kill the stuff that I had, and for the next 3 turns I got body count in a row.
And that was when we didn't realize you didn't get secondaries in skirmish.
Yeah.
I think he scored more on body count that game than or as much as he did the primary.
Yeah. It was and that was one where we ended. It was even before Pulse Round 2 was over. It was Pulse Round 2 turn 3 when you conceded. Or the end of turn 2.
Like one thing I've done ever since though, just subconsciously, is kind of kept a track of when body count would get scored in my games, even though I am playing skirmish a lot of the time. And I don't know why I've continued to do that, but I have. And it feels like it does happen about once a pulse round, at least when you're playing in sneaky. So, like just knowing that he's got this 6-point pad on his score, which by the way, body count reads each time you destroy 3 or more of your opponent's units. So units being not like squads, the whole squad, Warjack solo. During the single turn, score 2 victory points. It tips the balance a whole lot. Skirmish is already a very brutal format, and adding an extra brutal part to it is pretty rough.
Yeah.
I think honestly, Sneaky, I like how you were mentioning that, we did find out that we weren't supposed to be doing secondaries and stuff. And it mildly annoys me that in the packet here, it's a straight copy and paste from the rule book. And it says secondary missions below are lists of secondary missions. Secondary missions are chosen once the primary mission, which is the full size, has been determined. Meanwhile, you're writing down secondaries in your roster sheet, so you are using secondaries in skirmish, even though per the core rulebook, they were never intended for skirmish.
Yeah, it specifically says in the core rulebook that you don't use secondaries for skirmish. Now, in the phrasing for that, I think they just doubled up on the use of primary, as in primary is the non-secondary scenario. You know what I mean? Like primary is your scenario, and then secondary.
Right. I don't know. I really don't like they call the full battle force missions primary missions because everybody's used to them being called full battle force.
Yeah. Well, then also on top
calling
of
them primary now leads to a little bit of confusion if that is indeed the interpretation.
Yeah, and that actually goes into my next topic. If we're ready to move on.
You got anything to say on the secondaries, Josh?
No, like he alluded to, I have no experience outside of the fact that I did count a couple times how many times Spencer would have got body count on me. And I would say it was probably 4 out of 5 games, if not all 5. So
yeah. I just honestly, and like I say, like I was saying earlier, I feel like, it's hard, it's easy to complain about a problem, but not, give a solution. Honestly, they either need to remove the secondaries from skirmish entirely, or just retool them. Some of them I think are actually kind of interesting. Like I think Recon is actually a cool secondary. You can see your opponent going for Recon. Recon is first time you get a unit within 5 inches of your opponent's rear board edge, score 3 victory points. Now, I think recon is more interesting on full size, where the objectives are further from that board edge. I think they're usually 9 or 10 inches away from that rear board edge. So you really have to it's something you have to go out of your way for, but your opponent needs to be aware of, and it creates this really interesting counterplay. Whereas in skirmish on like boiling point, I think it's called, that objective is 6 inches away from the board edge. It's not even interesting to go for on skirmish.
Yeah, because the objective zone is actually a piece of it is 10 millimeters of it is actually inside the deployment zone.
Right. So, like I say, they just need retooled, maybe taken out of skirmish, maybe even just given new skirmish ones where they're worth less, but like they're harder to get. Because skirmish is a much more killy version of the game. And one thing I don't like about some secondaries is how they can become like win harder mechanics, and that's kind of where body count is for me. If I'm killing 3 of your things in one turn in skirmish, I've killed almost half your list, whether you have it all on the board or not, and I've killed a third of it because it's 8 and 1. I've killed at least a third of your list, whether you have it on the board or not, and then I'm getting rewarded further for it. So I just think they just need slightly retooled, and maybe body count. I think body count just needs to go.
Yeah, I agree. Now, on to my next subject is modified skirmish. So my issue with this is that it is on a skirmish board, which we'll talk a little bit about skirmish versus full size at another point as well, and some things I think they could do in order to fix the skirmish format. But my biggest issue is, as we've noticed, they've called the FBF, the full size, the primary size. And it's pretty clear from a lot of different things that the game was balanced around full size. And it was also pretty clear that, if you look at their first packet that they released, which was the narrative event, First Contact, the 11 and 2 format is on a full-size board for there. And there's no rules for an 11 and 2 skirmish mission in the full size. It says that 8 and 1 is the cap for skirmish, and anything over that is full size. So what happened here is that I believe that they set the def clocks too high, which we'll talk about in a second as well, and then had to make some concessions in order to allow for a tournament to go the length that they wanted to. And that concession was taking the 11 and 2 format and turning it into a skirmish board, which it was never intended to be. And that's it. I just think it causes problems. It also makes it to where so much more of the game is geared towards skirmish, which we feel across most of the community that I've noticed that have played both formats feels that skirmish is the least balanced of the two.
Correct. I mean, we have less scenarios for skirmish. There's so much first turn action on skirmish. Just trying to defend your models without perfect line of sight blocking stuff from like a scout dusk wolf on turn 1 is an art. There's a lot that goes on in skirmish that you can kind of tell the game was not focused on, right? Like, I don't think the skirmish is wildly a bad format. Don't get me wrong. I've played a ton of skirmish. I love skirmish. But
it's super fun.
But the problem is, as you get into the tournament, and this is kind of like one of the things when you play the tournaments by the way that they list it, you only play, I think, at most 33% of the tournament is a full-size game.
Yeah, it's 33% or less, depending on what size.
Right. Because at the five round tournament, the 17 to 32 player tournament, which if the game becomes fairly popular, I can see a lot of local game stores having that level game. Once we're allowed to go into game stores again, that you're playing 2 skirmish, 2 modified skirmish, and 1 full size. You're playing 4 skirmish games. You're playing more skirmish games than you have missions for skirmish currently, and then you're playing a full size game. I think it's a little jarring for the full size players that there's not some kind of even representation or almost even representation. And like I say, this does fall on the TOs a little bit. The TOs are free to do whatever they want with this they can make those full-size games if they would like. But just the guidance that's been given from Privateer Press, it's very skirmish heavy.
Yeah.
And like I say, like Spencer said, I do believe that's done with time restraints in mind.
Well, I always thought that PP would go with skirmish as their tournament format because when it comes to changing tables, making pairings, yada yada, a tournament of War Machine runs really long. So I would have thought they would have learned from that and maybe directed competitive play in Warcaster more towards the skirmish level. But if you're going to do that, you have to balance the game for skirmish and not necessarily full battle force.
Right, and I think the game would be more balanced towards skirmish with a few minor adjustments. I don't think
there's this one adjustment that needs to be made, but they're not going to. So,
well, what would your minor adjustment to rebalance skirmish be?
36-inch board. I think that's.
You think that would fix it? Because I still think that Scout Duskwolf is still threatening your deployment zone.
It's way harder to pull off. And maybe 18, 6, 5, that's 11, 29. Plus 5's 34. So, I mean, maybe, but it's also way harder to pull off, and it's way easier to position yourself in a way to where you can avoid that. You know, if you're going second player. And then it also spreads the scenarios out, making things like really short range weapons like flamethrowers and phase projectile cannons and stuff like that not be as ridiculous as they can be in skirmish. So I think, it's not going to fix everything, but it will fix the mass majority of the balance issues.
I think a bigger board would go a long way. But I do like some of the things they've tried to do in First Contact. They have a mission that I think is abysmal, but they did say, hey, first turn, second player has stealth. So it leads to these situations where, you're not losing. You don't have to do these weird positioning games with your solos on turn one. Now, unless they happen to be an army that has like a stealth out. But you can usually see that stealth out. So if it's Empyreans, they deployed a mantlet. Well, you kind of know what's coming. But it's one of those things where that would go a long way. I think certain rules could be different ranges on skirmish compared to full size. Stealth being a major one. I think that the 8-inch stealth range was intended for full size, and I think that's one of the big rules where people are like, well, this is the game. This is why you can tell the game's balanced for full size, because in skirmish, 8 inches is just not enough breathing room.
Yeah,
for stealth to be a meaningful rule.
Yeah, and Privateer Press straight up said when they at the very beginning, like after Kickstarter 1, that they were surprised by how excited people were for skirmish. Which is straight up telling right there that that's not where their focus was.
Right. That being said, maybe them acknowledging that means things will start slanting more towards skirmish.
Yeah. So
a little bit of optimism.
It's gonna have to. Like if this is their Pendulum format and that's what they're expecting people to play. Now, easy fix is like Justin said, is you just run those 11 and 2s on a full size board because you're the TO and you can do that. So
right. One thing that should be stated is the TO has so much power that isn't even listed in this document. If you're TO for this event, you really need to be careful with your player packet. Different things that are going to show up are like the objectives. I've seen many people playing the objectives very differently. And even Privateer Press says that's kind of up to your TO or whoever you're playing against. Because if you're using the objective markers, just the markers, a lot of people are playing you can stand on them. And there's no particular rule in the rulebook saying you can't. But if you buy the objective miniatures that go on top of your objective markers, they've said, well, that doesn't make sense that you'd be able to stand on a model. So you can't stand on those. So it's it's one of those things. There's a lot of pressure put on the TOs to make sure that these little rules and interactions don't happen, and it helps make less feel bads during the games. So just be very, very clear about what you want your terrain to be and your objectives, especially. Now, I also think that escalation format, as much as I love the idea, also puts a weird amount of pressure and effort on a TO, considering they either need to have 48-inch boards they've also marked down to 30-inch, or they need to have two separate sets of boards. But that's kind of what's expected when you have a format like this. So,
yeah, and then I will say something that I forgot to talk about when talking about the good about escalation is I really enjoy the fact that because the escalation format, people are going to be wanting to play both formats no matter what.
yes.
And so it makes it very easy to bring new players into the game because people are going to be playing skirmish, and that's the smaller size. It's the one that's easier to get people into. So it's going to incentivize people to play with new players, even if they're just super tourney focused, because they're still going to be playing those smaller board games regardless. So they might as well play it with a new player, and they can test out new stuff with new players, you know?
I think it's a very good point to bring up. Did you have anything else on your list for things you weren't super hyped about?
Yeah, I got a couple things. The only two more things, and three more things, and one's really, really simple. So I mentioned it. I'll go into this one because I mentioned it a little bit. The last thing was the death clocks. They're a large portion of the issues that we just had with the modified skirmish format and stuff is because of time restraints, and we feel that the death clocks are just way too long across the board.
Right.
So I mean, I just played a full-size game on Tabletop Simulator, which takes way longer than on the tabletop. And my opponent, who's again is I've never played on Deathclock before, so I went a little bit longer. But my opponent, who's experienced with Deathclock and has been practicing, which is what you're going to do if you're going to be playing in a tournament, finished off his clock at 1 hour and 13 minutes on TTS, where he would have had 1 hour and a half on the tabletop. And he wasn't even pressing, like he wasn't playing super hard. And it was Red from Hyper News Network, so he'll talk more about that on his podcast as well. But I definitely think that the death clocks could be shorter, and then that would open up more options for this escalation format.
Now, on this one, I do believe Privateer Press has said, I can't say who or where, I don't remember exactly. I do believe they said they've decided to make these more generous and kind of take the data and decide where the death clocks needed to be. But they didn't want to start a format where they were these super hyper competitive death clocks and then everybody's clocking out. And that's the way, 50% or more of the matches are ending.
Yeah.
So
100%.
This is just them being very cautious with it. And I actually don't mind this. This was something to be expected. They've already warned us about this.
Mm-hmm. That
this was, and like I say, this is kind of snowballing into why I think they've made the 11-2 skirmish. But it's one of those things that just know they know they're too long. They know that they can't stay at these lengths, and they shouldn't stay at these lengths. But they're kind of trying to see where the sweet spot is. Yeah. And it's better to overshoot that sweet spot than to undershoot it and have people come to events and just don't think they can actually finish a game.
Oh, 100%. And I know there's, we're, being a little salty about a couple of things that are in the packet, but it's 100% worth noting. This is a first draft, so
right. This is Go ahead.
I was gonna say, so things are gonna change. So once PP gets some data in and they can see what's actually happening, they're gonna make some adjustments. Which is, I'm hoping that my TTS league will be able to help out with that, since people aren't able to get into shops as much right now just because of the situation that we're in. But yeah, we definitely expect things to change.
Right. Like I say, this feels a lot more like a beta test to me. They kind of want some data from different things, I'm not sure what a proper route to would be to present that data to them. I do know that there are some Privateer Press staff that do show up in the Discord. So maybe just talking about it in Discord sometimes, when you have these kinds of things or presenting data there is fine. I don't know if there's a place where they would prefer this kind of stuff delivered, but
yeah. Well, I mean, I know once the current league is over, I'm going to compile a bunch of data, and then I'm just going to message Faye and just be like, hey, I gathered some data from the league I just ran. Would you like me to give it to you? And then see what she says. So.
Okay.
I personally like to think that Privateer Press listens to the podcast, but that's just wishful thinking.
A little optimistic there, Josh.
100%. Let's see. My other. Let me see. What were my other bads? Oh, the terrain guidelines. They said to stick with the quadrant terrain that they had listed in the original rule book, and from my experience with the game, it's just not enough terrain.
Did you actually read what the quadrant terrain says?
Yeah, it's placed 2 to 3 things in each quadrant.
What my biggest problem with that is, like, for skirmish, it probably works out fine. You probably have your 2 to 3 things and like a couple little scatter terrain pieces in deployment zones and stuff. And I tried making a board like that recently, just this last weekend, and that, generally speaking, that can make a pretty decent board, from what I saw. But where you run into problems is I don't know if that's enough for full size, because you're using the same 2 to 3 pieces for a board where you add 18 inches to both lengths.
Yeah.
And I gotta say, I haven't been making full size boards, but that to me sends red flags up that I'm using the same amount of terrain on a table for skirmish as I am for full size per the guidelines.
Yeah. I mean, just for comparison, just like throw some numbers out there. You're looking at 8 to 12 pieces of terrain, right, for the quadrant method. And my latest skirmish map, well, not my latest, my second to latest skirmish map, I counted up, and it had over 40 pieces of terrain on the board.
Well, that map is insane, and
let's give him credit, though.
The Arc of Shadows
it's a beautiful map. I'm not saying it's ugly. I'm not saying anything like that. I'm saying it's beautiful, but like, I hope that wherever I'm playing, they've got boards like that. Like, that is an insane expectation for a board.
He also makes, like, his boards are fun to play, and they feel fairly balanced. Like, as a Marcher Worlds player, please only give me 12 pieces of terrain on the board. Like,
right.
Yes, please. Where with the amount of terrain he puts on the board, it feels like I actually have to maneuver and be smart about placement. Where I've played on some maps where I can just sit on a point all game and just kill things.
Right. I do think that as far as this packet goes, they probably should say a little bit more about terrain. Because I've seen, just talking to people in the community, there are so many approaches to putting terrain down for this game, and it's so important to get terrain right for this game that it's something that probably deserves to be elaborated on a little bit more in the rule book.
Yeah, because, and like, I don't want to say like getting terrain right, but it's just understanding like terrain is so impactful in this game, just from a variety of instances, that it's just important to really appreciate how important terrain is, and being able to put it out in a way that is balanced and fair for everybody.
I agree. I think that's going to come with time, right? I think that, I think the TOs are going to run a tournament or an event or whatever, and they'll probably, I think a TO that's really wanting to improve is going to put out an AAR kind of thing, an after action report, and say, hey, one of those questions is going to be, how did you feel about the terrain? Was it too much, too little? Was it good terrain? Was it bad terrain? Did it impact your game? And really try and grow from that. I think that it's going to be a situation where there's going to be some growing pains with terrain.
Yeah, my after action report includes that question. Nobody ever tells me anything, so it makes me sad. But I'll just chalk that up to me making good maps.
Well, they're looking for somewhere they can make you sad, Spencer.
I mean, I for one do think you make good maps, even if they restrict my lines of fire.
Well, a good map should restrict your lines of fire.
Yeah, 100%.
I've heard so many different beliefs on maps. I've heard, hey, you know what? The objectives, they shouldn't be able to see each other, which I think is an interesting one. I don't think it should be true all the time. I think there should be specific ones that can probably see each other and have that counterplay. Because sometimes if you have too much terrain, it can make some rules less impactful as well, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Like stealth. Stealth is probably the hardest rule to gauge in the game as far as how useful it is or isn't.
Mm-hmm.
Because if you have this super terrain dense board, it's not an impactful rule for the most part, because in order to get that line of sight, they're probably within 8 inches of you anyways. Meanwhile, if you have this super open board, it technically becomes more useful. But on skirmish, because everything happens in such a small box, it's still just a not great rule. So it's very strange.
Stealth won me my round 2 game. It really did. It won me my round 2 game. But yeah, 100% about terrain impacting various rules and things like that. Like super high density boards are going to make stealth less valuable, but make things like ignoring line of sight and being able to walk through buildings more valuable. So it's just, yeah.
Well, I mean, even the type, like the walking through buildings, even the type of terrain. I know we did the AC cast, and I was saying how bad that ability was, and then I looked at a different set of terrain, and it was this really cool set that was like basically you were fighting in the sewers, and there were all these really thin walls between different places, and I was like, wow, maybe I was a little bit wrong on that, because playing on that board, that rule is super impactful.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not having to walk around these walls and get to doors. I can just go through the walls, and it feels like a much better rule then. So like just what kind of terrain you play with can really affect what rules are good and bad. I know the terrain that I personally play with at home, my walking through walls and buildings feels really terrible, because most of my buildings are 4x4 and about 3 inches tall. So it's a very hard to use rule in those situations.
Yeah. I mean, you have those little, I don't know if they were walls or like barricades that stacked on top of each other, but depending on where you place those, like it can be relevant.
Right. It could be impactful if that 4 inches of actually matters, right?
Yeah. But yeah, so terrain's really important. That's the moral of that story. I'm sure we'll do an episode eventually on that. And then the last thing that I had, this was the super simple one. Uncertainty principle is trash and needs to go there and should never be in a packet.
Well, as long as we're complaining about the scenarios, I'll second that. Because that one, in case you're not familiar, that's the one where it's the full-size mission where after the first battle round you get rid of 2 objectives.
Completely at random.
Completely at random, and it's
two out of 6.
One of those that can be very, very skewy. Sometimes you will get a good game out of it, right? Because hey, it just happens that everybody's actually fighting over these objectives that stayed. But what happened in mine and Sneaky's one time where we played the full-size battle is so big that it takes certain models out of the game, and if you've invested heavily in that area, it takes that a whole bunch of stuff out of the game. And so then, I was able to run the board with it a little bit because he didn't have as much stuff to react to me with. And there was no incentive for me to kill that stuff that had been over there. So that mission is rough. I don't know what they would do to actually fix it and keep it the same. I think actually in full size, maybe removing random objectives is probably bad.
I do have a really good idea for how to fix that scenario because Red and I were talking about this last night after our game. So I'm definitely going to run through that whenever we do our scenario episode, because I think it's a really good idea.
Something that we should probably say for the scenario episode, but that really needs to be brought up here for me, this is like number 1 on my list, is that so many of these missions in this packet are end of pulse round scoring. if anybody's talked to me about this game, one of my biggest gripes is how much end of pulse round scoring is, because it gives such a huge advantage to player 2. Player 2 already gets to choose board side, and now they get basically full priority on scoring. And it's in most of the missions. I want to say that end of pulse round scoring is all but one of the full-size missions and all but one of the skirmish missions. I know it's 100% all but one of the skirmish missions. I'm not super familiar on the full-size ones.
Full size, all but one, and that one has its own problems that we'll talk about.
Right. So, I think that the scoring for I think end of pulse round scoring should probably just go away, unless you're doing something to handicap it to give the first player a chance.
On the note of scenarios randomly disappearing, Spencer and I played somewhere between 4 to 6 games on one of those scenarios. Do you remember which one it was offhand?
It's probably Arc of Shadows.
And having scenarios disappear out from under you when you just deployed near it feels really, really bad and frustrating.
Well,
See, I'm gonna disagree with that on the
me and Spencer are both jumping on this one.
on the skirmish scenarios, because the skirmish scenarios are designed in such a way where you can account for the randomness and play around it. And that's probably one of the main reasons why you were struggling so much, is because I was doing that and you weren't. But you're a relatively new player, and it takes experience to get used to that and to plan for it.
Right.
I actually really like those scenarios. They're actually Chaos Theory and Arc of Shadows are my 2 favorite skirmish scenarios. Not from a balance perspective, but from a just playing them perspective, because I like that aspect of having to think ahead and plan out and make sure that I'm positioning my stuff in a way that no matter what happens with this scenario, I'm still going to be relevant.
So to a point, but so for friendly games, I agree that is super cool. But in an actual competitive format, throwing even more chance and essentially random number generation into the mix is always a feel bad. Like, you already have to worry about dice going your way and stuff, or dice going against you. So
Stop pissing off the gypsies, Josh.
One time, I don't know what happened. I've been atoning ever since. But having other aspects of the game, like disappearing scenarios, you could spread yourself out, but there's certain armies that do that better than others.
And that's fair. But and I think also the terrain can also make those scenarios feel worse.
That's true.
Because I know the one TTS scenario we have where it is that 5-point scenario, it does give you the option to kind of recover from those situations a lot easier because of the way that ladder mechanics work.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that both the ones on the side have a ladder really close to them to get to the center one. So if you're on the one side, that one goes away, well, then you can get to the center one and actually still have those models be relevant towards the game. If the center one goes away, then the models in the center can spread out. Now,
But
there's also the gambling aspect on that one where you don't know which one to spread out to. So
yes.
And also the important thing to note is that on those scenarios, both Arc of Shadows and Chaos Theory, there are permanent points that you can always fight over. Whereas in the Uncertainty Principle, there's not. Everything is random. And
they called it perfectly. They named it Uncertainty Principle. You are uncertain about anything that's about to happen in that scenario.
Indeed.
So kudos to them for a very appropriate name.
Indeed. But that's all that I had for the stuff that I was going to be, wanted to talk about. So,
should we wrap it up with some final thoughts?
Yeah, I think you pretty much covered most of my stuff too. I think we've covered, different things we liked and didn't like. I don't think there's really much more to elaborate on without going too deep into the scenarios, and I feel like that should be its own topic.
Correct.
Okay, well, I'll kick off our final thoughts by saying Spencer has been working super hard on a website for us. You can now find us at throughthevoidgate.com. There is articles on every faction up. You can find our podcast there. What else, Spence?
So basically, if anyone's familiar with the arcexchange.com, we basically just rebranded it as throughthevoidgate.com. So I've got, right now it's mostly geared towards new players. So I've got faction overviews for just a general idea of what all the factions do. I've got specific faction overviews breaking down all of the faction models, my thoughts on them. The stat cards are listed there. I do need to update a couple of the factions still, but there's still a ton of content. I've got a quick start guide, which is basically just like a 5-page breakdown of 90% of the rules from the rule book. An intro to Warcaster and why play Warcaster if anyone's wondering why they should get into it, or if they have some friends that have some questions, or they want to have a clear, concise answer on what makes Warcaster different from different games and why they should get into it, as well as some getting started guides on what to buy and how to build your forces over time in order to go from starting out at battle box all the way up to full size for each faction. And then my next set of articles after I'm finished updating these faction overviews is going to be loadout pages for each faction and different loadouts for all their Jackson vehicles. So that's going to be my next project.
That's super awesome. We're also kind of working on doing some broadcasted games with commentary over them, just to kind of let people see what's going on in a game, have like a hyper level analysis over what's going on, and kind of get an idea of what people are thinking about when they see different things happening, ways to analyze scenario, stuff like that. So keep an eye out for that. That'll be on the Essex Wargames YouTube channel.
Yeah, and it's a great way to really just learn some tactics and things, because instead of just like a normal battle report where you're just seeing people do things, having that analyzed and having people review like what their options were throughout the entire process, it can really help you develop that sense for tactics and what your options are and how to play. Like I know the one that's up on the YouTube channel right now is a great primer for deploying effectively and making sure that you're staying in scenario and how to how to manage your options when it comes to different scenario situations.
Also, if you just want a really good laugh, you can just watch it and listen to Justin and Spencer tell me everything I do wrong.
Well, we do that in the podcast too, so.
I mean, it's becoming a theme for sure. But all right, guys, thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you guys next time.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. This podcast is brought to you by Essex Wargames. Now, if y'all enjoyed the content, don't forget to subscribe. Now, for more content, you can check out the Through the Void Gate blog, or join us on the Essex Wargames Facebook, Discord, and YouTube. Stay safe and roll super strikes.